Hello, my name's Phelan Kane. I'm an Ableton certified trainer and we're here in Ableton UK's London studio office and we're going to be exploring the benefits of Max for Live. So you guys might be familiar with the idea of what Max for Live is, but it's really a powerful, super duper, crazy set of audio Lego. You can make your own devices, you can make your own instruments, your own synths, your own effects units, and you can create tools that make your music stand out from the crowd. You could be different. You could have a set of audio effects that no one else has got. You could build your own soft synth that no one else is using. So this is the real power of using Max for Live within Live Suite. So at the moment, Max for Live is an integral part of Live Suite. However, if you are a user of Standard or Intro, you can upgrade to Suite to feature the Max for Live set of tools. Or maybe, if you want to just add the Max for Live functionality to your copy of Live, you can take an extension and an upgrade for the Max for Live toolset. All of this stuff is available from the Ableton shop. However, within the Max for Live world, you've got a series of crazy additional packs. So a lot of you guys may be familiar with Ableton's packs. There's a whole bunch of different interesting sample libraries and effects units that are available from Ableton, loads of them free. So here we are at ableton.com, and if we just quickly dive into the packs section, we can see here we can go to the Max for Live button. We'll be able to look at all the specific Max for Live extensions you can get. So as I mentioned, a lot of this is free. A lot of them are commercial. But they're fairly affordable. But it's worth looking at some of the really useful ones that are freebies. So we can see over here, we've got, for example, a brand new selection of creative extensions that are part of the Live 10 suite, the Max for Live devices for Live 10. And that's a free download. There's also a whole bunch of interesting other step sequencers and effects units and processors. Another notable one is our Max for Live extensions kit, essentials kit. And this guy's got a polyphonic synth, a mono synth, and a great arpeggio step sequencer in it. So as you can see, for Max for Live, you can extend your collection of devices and instruments in Live. However, if you're a bit more brave than that, you can go into building your own stuff. And today we're going to look at creating a simple device that's going to be a unique distortion bit crusher effect. And we're going to go into Max for Live, into the depths of patching, and make ourselves our own effects unit. Okay guys, so we're sitting in Live at the moment, and we can see here we've got a familiar browser over on the left-hand side. As we know, this is where we find all of our funky, sexy categories of instruments and effects. But to start off today, we're going to have a look at the Max for Live category. So this is the category for the ninjas, and this will give you the option to dive into the Max for Live landscape. And obviously be a bit careful with this because you can lose your life in this folder. Max for Live is awesome, but it's really deep and there's so much you can do. But before we get into all of that, let's look at some more simple ways of using it. One of the best ways to start off with Max for Live is to use some of the built-in devices that ship with it. So here we can see three main categories of folder in our Max for Live category in the browser. And we can see here we've got a Max instrument for a virtual software instrument. We have a Max MIDI effect. This is for arpeggiators and effects like that, which really affect MIDI data. And then finally, we have our Max audio effect family, and this is really for audio processors. These are devices that will change the audio signal, for example, a reverb or a filter or a compressor. But let me just show you a couple of things that's the great way to get into using this, to be creative with this software. So the Max instrument folder is where you will find all the devices that are installed on your computer. Now, if you've got a copy of Live Suite, it's definitely worth diving into the Max for Live packs folder at ableton.com and download all the free content. As you can see here, there's actually a link already inside the browser for you. But let's just say we've done that, because that's really definitely worth doing. You're going to get loads of great free stuff. One of the great free things you get is the Poly object. This here is a polyphonic synthesizer. And this is a fairly new addition for Live 10. I'm now going to double click on this object and it's going to install the Poly synth on my selected MIDI track. So here we go, we're now loading the device. So it really operates just like a VST or audio unit plugin. There's not really much difference. It's a Max for Live device, but it's really a type of plugin. So now you can see we can play whatever we would like musically into Poly. And we have the option to create and use a musical part using this device. Obviously, you've got a whole bunch of parameters to play with here, filters, oscillator wave shapes, all the stuff you'd expect to see in any decent soft synth. Also, for this Max for Live device, we've got presets. So if I open up the little drop-down arrow here, we can see inside the Poly folder is a collection of built-in presets that ship with the device. And if you're a bit of an experienced live user, you know you can hot swap your presets using our little orange triangle down here, and then we can navigate the preset folder content with the up and down arrow keys. You actually get a preview. If you like the sound, press return as usual, and you've loaded that patch into your Poly device. So as you can see, using a Max for Live instrument is really similar to a VST audio unit, or in fact the inbuilt instruments that ship with Live. So just to let you know, guys, you've got a collection of built-in Max instrument synths inside Live 10 in Suite. There's synthesizer drum kits, claps and cymbals. There's mono synths, there's poly synths. There's all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. Obviously, in a similar way, you've got the audio effects category. In here you can see a convolution reverb. Yes, there is one in Live. It's a Max for Live device in Live Suite. You've also got a whole bunch of other weird and wonderful effects units. For example, the granulator, or maybe some sort of interesting bonkers LFO devices. So a simple way of using Max for Live to extend your creativity is to explore the free content that ships with Live Suite. And obviously this might involve a little download, but you'll be able to add in hundreds, if not thousands, of new processing tools and instruments into your library. So definitely worth checking out. So guys, as we can see now, we're going to come into doing some more ninja stuff by building our own sort of stuff. Now we're going to make a crazy degrading effect, an audio effect in Max for Live. This is a bit of a simple effect, but it's a really good place to get started. And we can see a little example of what the final device is going to look like at the moment. So here he is. This is the computer music Degrader, built in partnership with Metafunction, which is me, my little software company. And what we've got here is a bit crusher and sample rate mangler. So it's really easy to build this because there's only a couple of controls. We've got a control that changes our bit depth. So we can go from 24-bit all the way down to maybe 12-bit. Might be good to put a crunchy drum loop through that. It'll be a bit like the Akai MPC 60 or even the EMU SP1200 from the 80s. Great crusty hip-hop drum machines. But you can go all the way down to maybe 8-bit and even into sort of chiptune territory, 4-bit nastiness. Eventually down the bottom here we get into 2-bit and it's just wrong, broken. The other control we've got is a sample rate divider. So this is like called ratio. So when it's on 1, we've got lovely sample rate that's a setting of our host DAW for maybe 44.1K. And moving it down, we start to get into more alias effects, and we add some dirty grunge to the audio signal. So all the way down the bottom, again, it's getting quite nasty. So using these two controls together, we can start to build some really dirty, distorted, hideous noise. And we've got to be a bit careful because this is going to be quite capable of making some really loud, extreme noises. So we've got a little volume control here just to make sure we follow health and safety procedures at all times and you don't blow up your hearing. So this is the Degrader. We're going to build this together, but you're also going to be able to download this from a link we'll stick in the comments below that allows you to look at the final version at home. So if you get any trouble following along with the tutorial today, you've got an opportunity to download the final version and have a look inside and see how we built it. So hi guys, welcome back here. What we've got is our Degrader. We just saw this a second ago in terms of what we're going to make. We've got a nasty distortion unit. So let me just get rid of that because we're going to build this from scratch. We're going to do this together. We're going to go through the process of how to make this device. Obviously, you can download it from the comments, as we mentioned a minute ago, but we're going to do it as a walkthrough, so you can actually learn how to get into the basic functionality of using Max for Live. So I'm going to delete this track. So at the moment, we're looking at a blank, empty MIDI track. So as we said earlier, our browser on the left-hand side features our Max for Live categories. And we said there's a Max audio effect family, there's a Max instrument family, and a Max MIDI effect family. So we're really going to dive into building an audio effect today. We could send into this processor any instrument we like. We could send in a vocal from maybe an audio clip. We could send in wavetable from Live 10. We could send in any third-party VST audio unit instrument. So this is a audio effect processor. Inside our presets, there's obviously a whole bunch of stuff to play with, but there's a really special, important first preset for today. This is the top one. So this preset is really the default empty Max audio effect object. So this is what we want to use to start with today to build our device. So it's definitely recommended always start on the empty default preset. It's a bit mental to try and go into an existing device and build something inside it. You really want to start with a blank canvas. So here's our Max audio effects. We can double click, it loads this preset of a Max audio effect onto our MIDI channel. So at the moment, nothing is really going to happen. This device doesn't really do very much, but it's a really important beginning place to start working from. So as you can see down here in our little device, we've got the usual sort of suspects. We've got our preset button for saving our own preset inside the live user library. We have a hot swap dial, which we saw a bit earlier, to navigate through some of the inbuilt presets in our library. But there's a big difference between a Max for Live device and a built-in Ableton instrument or even a third-party VST AU. We have a magic button called the Edit button. So I'm just going to open up the info view in the bottom left-hand corner. This is a great little extra panel inside Live's GUI. Allows us to navigate and point at different aspects of the UI and learn a little bit more about what some of those features are. If I point at the Edit button, it says this allows us to open or close the Max device editor. So this is the little button that opens the gateway to Max for Live. So be warned, you might be stuck in here for the rest of your life. It can get a bit hairy, but that's good. With great power comes great responsibility, Padawan. So let's hit our little Edit button, we'll see what happens. Ta-da! So now we've actually opened Max. We are now running a separate piece of software within our setup. We can see from our drop-down menu across the top of the screen, we have a whole bunch of typical options like File, Save As, Open, etc. But we're actually looking at Max. This is Max 8. Max 8 is inbuilt within Live 10 via the Max for Live package. Max for Live is a bridge that links the world of Max into the world of Live. Max is an application, it's been around since the late 80s. It was developed at URCAM at Paris. It's a graphical programming environment. And actually, Max for Live allows us to integrate the Max 8 world inside Live. This is the sexy bit. This is the bit that lets you build your own devices in your own DAW. That's super powerful. So what we're diving into here is running Max and Live at the same time on the same computer, using the Max for Live license to integrate them both. So that's the powerful, interesting thing for music producers, to have this connectivity between Max and Live. That's awesome. You can actually also buy Max as standalone. It's quite expensive, it's like $400 or $500. But obviously that's leading into a world of doing interesting sonic processing as Max is a standalone application. And I think most producers, computer musicians, probably want to integrate this into their DAW, i.e. Live. So the Max for Live environment allows us that integration of producing a track in Live and adding some of the crazy functionality of Max. So let's have a quick overview of some aspects of the Max for Live GUI. What we're seeing here is called the patching window, and we can see, I can just obviously see a couple of different strange objects in here. But running around the edge of the patching window is a whole bunch of GUI controls. We've got here different windows and panels we can open from the left-hand side over here. On the toolbar, we have these different objects that allow us to navigate and open different windows. So across the top is a collection of different GUI-related stuff. Over here, we've got some other important windows which we'll look a bit later, for example, the inspector. And then down the bottom, there's a couple of important controls involving things we're going to dive into in a minute. But in a nutshell, the patching window contains quite a lot of important functions and features we're going to use quite a bit throughout our development of this particular device today. Obviously also, you've got some typical objects up here, for example, saving your Max for Live device within the Max file menu. There's a few other options here to allow you to do arranging of some of your objects and stuff, so some of this we might dive into later. There's a great feature here to allow you to zoom in and zoom out of your patching window. So for example, maybe to sort of get a bit of a better resolution, we can sort of come in here and see things a bit more clearly. And obviously, like any sort of major software, we typically see the key commands listed inside our control here. So if I use the zoom out and zoom in key commands here, we can sort of get a bit bigger, and maybe it might be a bit easier for you guys to see in the screen catcher. So much like any sort of app, really, we've got all the typical functionality, but it's worth bearing in mind we're running Max alongside Live and are communicating via the Max for Live protocol. So one of the things we'll probably do quite a bit is jump between Live and jump between Max. And if you're running on Mac OS, you can get to the application switcher from the Command Tab key. It allows you to navigate through your apps. There's a very similar thing on Windows. But we can see we can move between Live and we can move between Max fairly quickly. So what we're going to maybe try and do here is just change something in this default device. So at the moment, this device doesn't really do anything. We've got a little bit of a description here. It says the audio from Live comes into our Max world, and it comes in via an object called plug in. So this is our first Max object we're going to see. Plug in is an object that brings the audio from Live into our Max environment. As we can see, we've got two cables here that are running out of the plug-in object, one for left, one for right, and they're connected to an object called plug out. Guess what that does? That's the object that feeds the audio back to Live, back to the DAW. So at the moment, our device doesn't really do very much because there's nothing in the middle. It just passes the audio through unaffected. And as you can see here from our comment we have, it says, build your audio effect here. So we want to put something in between the input and the output. In a way, we want to insert an audio effect in between that, much like you might do within a typical DAW mixing environment. You might insert your compressor on your channel. We can insert some sort of device in between those cables to process the sound. And because Max allows you to do crazy amounts of different types of processing, you've just got so many different options you can explore. So really it's about developing objects and connecting them. Again, it's that reference about audio Lego. It's a little bit like spaghetti cables. It's about patching things in. So Max was really developed to try and give us some sort of graphical modular synthesis world. That was one of the main reasons it was originally invented back in the late 80s. So we're going to get into that, but for now, let's see what we can do to maybe think about how we can edit this. One of the most important functions to be aware of in the Max GUI is the lock button. So it's down here in the bottom left-hand corner, and we can see when it's locked, we can interact with the patch, we can use it as a user, we can maybe tweak a parameter of our device. And when it's unlocked, we can actually go into builder mode, where we can edit and customize the objects. So that's a really important button, guys, to realize. And there's a little key command that's worth remembering. One of the few key commands in Max for Live that's important. And you can see over here, it's Command E. So that's going to allow us to lock and unlock our patch. And obviously to actually add objects and build something, we need to unlock it. So what we're going to do right now is just see how we can customize something and save this device. And then once we know that, we've probably got enough information to start to build our own device. So I'm going to select this object here, which is a comment, and you can see here it's got a blue highlight around it indicating it's selected. Another really important part of the Max GUI is the inspector. And we can open the inspector by clicking on the I symbol on the right hand side, or we could use the key command if you're a ninja, Command I. Once again, all of our key commands, typical software stuff, we can see there listed up inside our drop-down menus if you forget. So the inspector allows you to configure the properties of the object that's selected. So for example, if I had another object selected, my properties are different. They're unique to the type of object you've selected. So as a simple little example here, we're going to grab the first comment and we're going to have a look inside our inspector. There's 4 different panels here. You can customize the information the inspector is showing you. You have a basic, a layout, a recent, and then all. And we're probably going to be sitting in the all mode most of the time. That's going to give us access to every parameter for our object. So just to show you a quick way of using this, I'm going to scroll down and we can see down here we've got a whole bunch of different information, and sort of right down the very bottom of the inspector for this selected object, which is called a comment, we can see there's a text label here. So we can double click and we can actually edit this. So we could say build and effects, for example, press return. And you can see we've updated that property for this object. So the inspector is a fundamental part of Max and Max for Live. It allows you to edit and customize the properties for the objects you've got selected. And you're probably going to spend a lot of time inside the inspector when you're building devices in Max. So definitely worth remembering Command I to open the inspector and shut it, Command E to lock the patch or unlock it. So finally, now we've seen a bit of a basic overview of the GUI, let's go inside the file menu and select Save As. And what we're going to do here is save our device. Now, something to be aware of, Max for Live likes its devices to be saved inside the Ableton user library. And that way, your devices will show up inside the browser in Live on the left-hand side. So it's worth bearing in mind that you should really save all your work you would do in Max for Live inside your user library. And by default, it should point directly to that location. So the standard installation path name for Max for Live is, well, for the user library for Live, is going to be inside your music folder on Mac. You have Ableton. Then you obviously see your user library, which contains all the content that Live uses. On the Windows, it's in a slightly different location. I believe it's in the Documents folder. So at the moment, I'm saving or creating a Max audio effect, so I need to save my device in that folder. If I was creating a Max instrument, it would default to the Max instrument folder. So it's definitely not a good idea to save your work in a different location. If you do that, it will still work, but it won't show up in your browser. And you want to have the easy functionality of grabbing your devices when in the middle of a production. So all I've got to do here really is give my device a quick name. And what's important also to realise is the file extension of what we're saving here. And this is what we call an AMXD device. I guess it's an Ableton Max device. So the extension of your devices in Windows and macOS is .amxd. That is a Max for Live file. That would work inside Max for Live. If you have a full copy of Max, there are different file extensions you can use, but maybe you could explore that at your leisure. So all the stuff we save is an AMXD. They're quite small files. You can share these on the internet. We'll have a bit of a look at that later. I've got some good resources you could share. But just to be aware, we're saving a specific type of file format. So once we've actually saved it, we can close our patching window and we'll be able to come back to our browser and we could go to our Max for Live audio effects category. We may need to rescan the folder. And the simple way to do that is just expand it and collapse it a couple of times. And eventually you should see your device show up in that folder. So that's the benefit of using the built-in user library and saving it into that location. It will always show up inside your browser by default. Okay, so let's get into building something. So to start off with, we're going to actually come back into our device and we're going to edit this. We're going to build our degrader and we're going to save it as a different file name. So once again, the first step of the process is to hit the edit button to open it up. We're back into the patcher window. Obviously, to see this a little bit better, we could zoom in. So I'm going to use the key command to do this. Obviously, also available within our drop-down menu. We have our view menu that allows us to configure our resolution. And we've got quite a few objects in here. We mentioned earlier the plug-in brings the audio from the DAW host live, pumps it out to the plug-out. And what we need to do is actually integrate our effect in between those two objects. But we've got quite a lot of comments at the moment. We've got these different objects that are giving us some text-based comment. We don't really need them. So we can select these and actually delete them with the delete key. And we can tidy up our device at the moment just to make it a little bit more intuitive for us to build. So I'm deleting everything apart from our plug-in and our plug-out. Okay, so we're ready to get going. So we can actually maybe think that we're literally going to insert our processor in between this signal flow. And we're going to build our processor from a combination of existing Max objects. We've used the expression quite a few times today about objects, but one thing to be interesting for exploration in Max for Live is to get to know the objects available. So on the far left-hand side here, we can see the object button within our toolbar in our side window. And we've got here a massive list of objects that are available in the Max landscape. Obviously, there's different searching criteria here. You could maybe focus on just Max objects. You could focus on Max for Live. You could focus on MSP. These are the different categories of objects that exist inside Max. Max objects are generally used to edit data, and these are really useful for building MIDI effects, arpeggiators, sequencers. These don't process audio, they process MIDI information typically. Another interesting category is jitter, which allows you to do video processing, video graphical interfaces and weird webcam simulations. And also MSP, that's our other really important folder. That's Max Signal Path. These are the objects that process audio. And they've all got a very unique type of weird symbol. We can see here all of the different objects available inside our MSP object list. I've got a funny little wiggly symbol at the end. This is called the tilde, and this is available on your computer keyboard. It's down by the left shift key, and this identifies a Max signal processing MSP object from a Max object. So all the funky stuff about building a soft synth or maybe making an audio effect mostly uses the MSP or the tilde objects. So one of the good things to do when you get into Max a little bit, Max for Live, is to explore this folder. There's a load of stuff in there. There's filters, there's FFT pitch processors, there's sine waves, there's sawtooth waves, envelope generators, all sorts of stuff. We're going to start off today with a slightly different approach, so we can use a different type of way to access our objects. Now out into the main patching area, probably the third most important key command to note is the letter N, N for new. That opens up a type box where you can simply type in the name of your object. So we know we're going to use a specific object for our effect. That object is called Degrade, and it's part of the MSP processing. So if we simply type in, or begin to type in Degrade, it auto-completes for us. We can see just underneath it here, it gives a little description of what the object does. It says it's a signal quality reducer. So now simply by pressing enter, we've generated and built our Degrade object. We can pick this object up, move it about. We can extend it, make it a bit wider or a bit thinner. But generally, we've got ways to change its location and position on the screen. So guys, another really important thing about these objects in Max, they've all got inlets and outlets. And when you hover your cursor over an inlet, you get a little pop-up window that describes what the inlet is. So the Degrade object, its first inlet on the far left-hand side is the audio input. You can see here it says signal in brackets, followed by the word input. So that means it takes an audio signal. It will take the audio signal from maybe your DAW or what other object you would create inside Max. And it's a general audio stream, much like you might find in a channel strip on a mixer. The second inlet here, inlet 2, is for a parameter. And this is what we're going to use to control the settings of the degrader. And this one takes a float signal, and you can see here it says sample rate ratio. My last inlet, inlet 3, is again for a parameter, and this takes what it says is an int or integer. We're going to talk about those two things in a minute, and they play a really fundamental part of the Max for Live building experience. But this particular parameter or inlet is for the resolution in bits, bit depth, 24-bit, 16-bit, etc. This object's only got one outlet on the left-hand side here, outlet 1, and that is the audio output. It's the signal that runs out of the degrader. So obviously we have an input for audio, an output for audio, and there may be a number of inlets for different types of parameters depending on the object you're using. So Max is all about patching. It's all about creating and adding stuff. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take these cables, these patch cords that exist. These patch cords are stripy tiger tails, and that represents an audio signal. So we can actually select a cable and delete it if you want with a delete backspace key. That's one way of doing it. Another way is to simply select the cable and use the green or the red circles to pick up the cable and move it around. So just like a modular synthesizer, we can repatch stuff. What we want to do with our object here is send our input into the degrader. So we're bringing our audio signal from live through the plugin object, and we're now patching into the degrader. We're going to be a bit cheeky here, and we're going to do some fake stereo. So we're going to take the left and right signal from live, and we're going to patch it into our degrader. So really, we're making a mono to stereo effect. We could make a stereo degrader if we wanted to, a little bit more complicated. But for now, simplicity might be a bit easier. So this is our input signal. Let's take our output signal and patch that into the plug out. And again, we're going to take a copy of the left channel into the left speaker, and we'll take a copy, the same signal, the same audio signal into the right speaker. So it's a mono to stereo processor. There's not really going to be any stereo imaging involved in this. It's a simple device. So there's an easy way to edit and tweak patch cables. You can simply select them, use the red and green circles to move them, or you could delete them and just click and drag to make a new cable and patch it into the relevant input or output. Okay, so now we've got our audio signal going. This patch will effectively work properly, but we need to start to integrate a few ideas for the user. We want to have some parameters that is going to allow us to adapt the settings. So this is going to introduce to us probably one of the most important families of category of objects in the Max for Live world, and these are known as the Max for Live family. Now all of the categories in the object browser over here on the left that really live in the Max for Live landscape, the majority of them have the words live dot at the front of their name. So a live dot object is a specific Max for Live object, and it's really recommended to use the Max for Live live dot objects whenever you can. That means they're going to tap into Live's automation automatically. They're designed to work within the Max for Live landscape, and they're much more easy to manage for GUI or user interface. So I want to drag a live dot dial. I want to pick that up, click on it, and create a live dot dial. These dials are very similar in their appearance to the built-in controls inside Live. And we're going to customize this parameter to be able to be used with our degrader. So we'll select it, we'll open the inspector on the far right-hand side. We'll make sure we've selected the all parameter so we can see all of the information for the slider. And we're going to slide down a little bit here and find a few important properties to change. So this is going to be our control to change the ratio setting, the sample rate ratio. What this means is when the slider is 1, we're working at your system's sample rate, maybe 44.1K. When it's at 0.5, we'll be working at half your sample rate of the system, maybe 22K. So we're going to connect this dial to this second inlet. And we can see here, this is not a stripy cable because this cable transmits data. It's not transmitting audio signal, it's transmitting parameter control information. So big distinction here. Let's select our live.dial, come back over to the inspector, and we're going to customize and change some of the really important properties here. The first one is the name. We want the name to show up in the GUI so your user understands what the parameter does. Now it's a little bit confusing because there's quite a few name parameters in the inspector, but it's really good practice to stick the same name in all the fields. So what I'm going to do here is double click on the long name section and I'll simply type in ratio. And you can see it hasn't really updated the GUI. The long name is related to Live's automation. So that's a useful thing to set appropriately. The short name directly beneath it is the one that works with the GUI. So let's type that in and you can see, bang, it updates. So short name is related to user interface, long name is related to automation. The next thing to consider is what type of numbers does this dial kick out? So if you've ever done any sort of looking at more nerdy stuff in computers, maybe you might have done a bit of Python, maybe you might mess about in things like Unity or Unreal gaming engines. There's a thing in computer science which is all about the type of data. And what we want here is a data type for our slider that is going to be a float. It's a floating point number. It's a number that has decimal places. Most numbers in a DAW that process audio systems are floating point numbers. So it might be something like 0.4736, whatever. Our slider needs to have a decimal place number. It needs to be a float. So the data type is float. We're going to see a little bit later on our second control that we'll use an integer or an int, which is a whole number, 1, 2, 3, 4. So often the float or the int play a big role inside Max for Live. And often you've got to be careful to set the type of data type for your slider to be correct. If you hover over the inlet here for our input, it says float in brackets. So we've got a clue inside each object. What type of data type or number does the input need? This needs a float input. Okay, so moving down, we can see we've also got another important parameter here. It says range stroke enum. And the range is really about what's the range of numbers the slider can kick out. So maybe if you're making a filter for the cutoff frequency of a synth, you might go from 20,000 to 20. What's the range of numbers the dial is going to produce? In this particular example today, we're going to go not quite 0 to 1. We don't really want to take a ratio all the way to 0 because we'll probably blow up our speakers. So we're just going to change the values in the range number. And we're going to go 0.1 space 1 point. And what that's really done is told Max to use floating point numbers, and our slider is going to go its maximum setting 1 and its lowest setting 0.1. We don't quite want to go down to 0 because we might blow up our monitors. And you can see now the slider has got a different numerical range in its GUI. So the range is really important. The data type, the type, and the range are two important things we use. The last little stuff we want to put inside this particular object here, probably maybe the final important little parameter to set, is our unit style. And this is going to give us a way to customize the GUI. Maybe if we're using a filter, we want the display for the slider to be in hertz, makes sense, frequency. If it's a volume control, it should probably be in dB. This particular control is a bit wacky, it's a ratio, but we want to set the unit style to float. And that way we know we're going to have decimal places on our dial in our user interface. So again, we've got data type, we've got range, and we've got unit style. These are three really important things you set on every parameter within your device. The final little bit in the inspector for this particular slider is the initial enable. So we're going to tick this box. Once it's ticked, the value underneath it, the initial value, is active. And this gives us a way of setting what the default value will be when you first load your patch. So this is like the default setting. Maybe on a soft synth, the filter might come completely fully open at 20K when you load the synth. Be a bit mental to have your filter at 20 Hertz. You might not hear anything when you play the synth. So we're going to set our initial value here to 1 dot. And really explicitly putting the decimal place in because it's a float. So guys, now we've made our first parameter. It's the ratio control that allows us to set the sample rate of the degrading object. So we've got a dial here, which is configured with the correct parameters in its inspector. And let's just have a look at how this works. So what we really should do now is lock our patch. We can come down to the bottom left-hand corner of the GUI, use the padlock to lock it, or if you're a ninja working and operating from a parallel universe, Command E. Yeah? Now you can see we can integrate with the patch as a user, and we can actually spin the dial around. And we can see it goes from 1 down to 0.1. So we can see our parameters, our properties have been set correctly in the inspector to allow this particular control to work successfully with the degrade. So let's keep rocking. We're going to unlock the patch. And one of the great things about Max is you can basically just copy and paste stuff. So if you've done some work, you can really easily configure the second slider. So for example, we could copy and paste our ratio dial. We've got a brand new dial. We're going to use this dial here to control our bit depth or bit resolution. So we can cable from the dial into the third inlet. And obviously this particular dial now is going to be our resolution in bits. So we have to configure this one a little bit differently from our ratio. This particular inlet needs an int or a whole integer number. So let's make sure the dial's selected, come over to our inspector, and obviously probably a really good idea to set up our name. So we're going to call this resolution, and we're going to set up the short name and the long name so it would work in automation. The type of data we need for this slider is not an enum or a float, it's an int. So we're going to set this to be an int. And we can see here, we want the range of the int to be, well, to make sense within a music production environment. So most users are working at 24-bit nowadays within their DAW. It's a standard bit depth. So we want to have our range maybe being the maximum 24, but we probably want to have a minimum. Now we could say things like 1 space 24, but that's going to allow you to take your bit depth down to 1 bit. And that's going to sound pretty nasty, gnarly, and very loud. So for health and safety reasons, we're going to go from 2 to 24. So 2 space, the space is really important, 24. And notice we're not using a decimal place because it's an integer, it's not a float. Okay, the other parameters we need to configure for this, very similar to before, we want to set our unit style to be int. So this is going to allow the graphical interface, the slider for the GUI, to be showing whole numbers. So it's really important to set your unit style. And then finally, to configure initial enable. So we're going to switch that on again, and it might be good practice to launch the device with the resolution set to 24. So we're going to put in the initial value for this slider to be 24, maximum bit depth. So now you can see, guys, we've actually patched stuff in. One of the things to be aware about in Max for Live is sometimes you might run out of space inside your GUI because we're truncating some text here. So let's just drag the corner of this slider around a little bit, make it a bit bigger. We can see the whole name now. And obviously to test it, we can lock the patch, Command E, or use the toolbox. We can now see we can navigate between 24 and 2 for our bit crusher. Yeah? Okay, so there's a few more things we need to do to get this working. It might be a really good idea to actually add in to our patch a little volume control. If we were to set our resolution and our ratio to really extreme low numbers, we're going to get really loud audio. So to protect your speakers and your hearing, we're going to stick in a little volume fader to pull down the gain of the device, just to make sure we don't clip and distort and damage anything. So this is going to be sitting between the plug out and the degrader. And the type of control we're going to use is another live dot object. So we're going to press N for new. We're going to type in live dot, and the object we need is gain, live dot gain. And you can see this is a decibel volume slider. So this is really easy to use. We're going to create one of these. We've got a little funky fader, and we're simply going to patch that into our signal path. So we could maybe make a little bit of space here. We can recable the left and right inputs. We're coming from the degrader into the live dot gain. And now we want to take the signal path from the live dot gain out into the plug out object, feed it back to live. Now you might need to be a bit careful here because there's quite a lot of outlets on the live gain. And the first 2 are the ones we use. it's quite easy, if you zoomed quite far out, to mouse it. And if you put the wrong output here, you might have some serious volume issues with your speakers. The other outlets aren't really for audio signal. They're down to do with parameter values. So probably not a good idea to use those. We're going to make sure the first outlet goes to left and the second outlet, which is channel 2, goes to right. Magic. So now we've got a little volume slider. There's quite a few things you could do to change the properties of the volume slider. So we've selected it. We're going to jump over to the inspector on the far right hand side. Don't forget the I button opens the inspector, or Apple key I. And now inside here we can customize the properties for the slider. At the very top of our inspector, there's one here called orientation. At the moment it's set to vertical. So if we have a look inside this menu, we can see we've got a horizontal option. It might be a bit nicer to use horizontal. We're just going to set that up to save a bit of screen real estate. The only other thing we should really do to this slider is to maybe give it a slightly more useful name. But at the moment, it's got a default name of live.gain. That's not very intuitive. So let's double click and we'll just call it output gain or something like that. So this is going to give us a slightly more useful name, which will show up inside our automation system and on our user interface. So we can copy and paste those into our two name fields. And then just to maybe make sure we're looking after the output volume of our device, because it will get loud, let's switch on initial enable and pull down the initial value of the slider maybe to -12 dot. That will give us a value of -12 dB when we first load the patch. So far we've made most of the objects for our device. We still need to work on the GUI. We still need to work on the presentation mode. But this is a really good place to just take a quick pause and to save our device. So we're going to make sure we have our device selected, jump to the Max file menu, not the Live file menu, and select Save As. I'm actually going to save this device in the default location, the Max Audio Effect folder, and we could probably give it a bit more of a sexy name. So I'm going to call it the Degrader and press return. So guys, congratulations, you built a device, you've patched everything in you need, we've actually saved it. Now we've saved it, we can see in the background in Live, we can see the device has some weird objects in it. Actually, what we're looking at here is the patching window represented as a GUI inside Live's device view. What we really need to do is customize this to make it a bit more user-friendly. So this is the whole concept of having presentation mode. One of the sort of final, most important buttons within the sidebar in Max is the presentation mode button. So we've seen the importance of the unlock button. We've seen the importance of the inspector, where we configure properties. We've also seen there is an objects panel where you can explore all the objects available in Max for Live. The final button that is really fundamental is this funny little TV screen looking button down here, presentation mode. So at the moment, inside Max for Live, we're working in patching mode. Presentation mode is an alternate view. So when you hit this button, you have a little yellowy colour in your patching mode button to showcase you're in presentation mode. You're not in patching mode, it's a toggle button. We don't actually see any objects though, because we really need to add them to presentation mode. Now this is super simple. So what we're going to do here is go back to patching mode. So the presentation mode TV button is not coloured. We're going to make sure we've unlocked the device so we can select our objects. We want to select the dials, and much like most software, we can shift click to grab multiple elements, or obviously marquee. I'm going to select the two dials and the output gain. Now once all three are selected, we're going to add these to presentation mode. So in short, you add your user interface objects to presentation mode. That allows your user to have access to them in the GUI. Obviously we don't need to add the degrader. That's not really a user interface object, that's a processing object. That's going to sit there and do its job. We don't really need to present that to the user. So let's come back and select all of our user interface elements. Here's one of the secret menus in Max. We're going to control click anywhere within any of the selected objects, and the contextual menu pops up, and we're going to choose add to presentation. This is going to add these objects into presentation mode. So once we've added these to presentation mode, we can simply click away, and we notice there's a option now to allow us to view them inside our window. So here we go. Let's actually click the correct button, add to presentation. When we click away, there's a weird orangey, reddy outline around the sliders. So in patching mode, when an object has been added to presentation, we see a red-orange hint around the control. Now, when we enter presentation mode for our little button, we'll see those objects have appeared in our interface. Now we're free to set these up and position them however you like in your GUI. You can obviously snap objects together, much like you might do in Adobe Illustrator or something. You can drag and configure and set up your GUI to work in any way you like. So as you can see here, it's a good practice to try and position your objects in the top left-hand corner. This is the ground zero for the user interface, top left-hand corner. This is because really in Max for Live and Live, there's a slight limit on the screen resolution for the devices. As we can see, we've got a certain amount of screen real estate for the device view in Live, and this is represented by the device limit line that is across the graphic when you're in patching mode. When I enter presentation, we want to make sure all of our objects will be up above that line. So up in the top left-hand corner, it's really important to be aware of the amount of screen real estate you've got when you're building a Max for Live device. It's a little bit thin, but this is part of the nature of the UX of Ableton and the live environment. So these objects have been added to presentation mode. There's one final little trick which everybody always forgets, and this is to actually make our patch itself default into opening in presentation mode. And it is really easy to forget this one. What we need to do is make sure nothing is selected, and we select a background area of our patch, and we control click to open a contextual menu. In this menu, we want to go to the inspector window. So this is the inspector window for the whole patch. It's not the inspector for a slider or a UI object, it's the inspector for everything. And it opens in a funky little floating window. So inside here, there's a parameter we need to tick. And the quickest and easiest way to get to this is to select the basic mode, and therefore we can find easier and quicker the open in presentation box. So if we switch that on, we can now see our patch shows us the screen real estate in presentation mode. It's a bit mental. This should probably be switched on by default in Max. Maybe that's going to be a feature added in the future. But this is a really important button. If you don't have this on, your GUI down here inside Live will never show you your designed user interface. So let's close down our inspector, and simply if we save our device, we should keep an eye on the live device view down here, and we'll see our interface appears as if by magic inside Live in the background. Bang. So as you can see, you've got a bit of space here to configure your patch how you like it. You can set it up how you want. Obviously, there's a whole art of user interface design that goes beyond the scope of this particular tutorial today. So we've now managed to build a user interface by using presentation mode. We've added to presentation mode our objects we want to present to our user. And we always remember to set the actual patch itself, the main patch, into presentation mode, otherwise it won't work. An easy way to check, if you see a UI in the Live device browser in the bottom of Live, in the device view, then it's working properly. If you see cables in there, you haven't switched on presentation mode properly. So let's get closer to completing our device now, guys. There's a few more things we could do. But you know, we might want to get to a position now to test it, to make sure we've got some audio. So I'm just going to save this again. Now, as Max for Live is a bridge or a link between Max and Live, it's probably best practice to test your patch inside Live. So I'm going to make sure I've saved my work, and I'm actually going to close the patching window and focus on getting some audio signal running through Live. So guys, we're back into Live now, and we can see our Degrader device is sitting here inside our device view, inside the Live GUI. So what we want to do is test this out. We want to make sure this is actually working. But as we mentioned earlier, it's a bit crusher, and they can get quite extreme. So let's start off by pulling down the output gain folder to 0. We just want to make sure we're not going to do any damage to our ears or our speakers, and we'll gradually fade this slider up once we insert an effect or an instrument we can use to process through the degrader. So one of the sort of simple ways to do this, I guess, is just load up a built-in instrument from Live. I'm going to go to the instruments category on the far left-hand side of the browser, and obviously suite owners will have the ability to use Max for Live and maybe have the option of analog and operator, etc. I'm just going to double click on analog and insert it in my channel. And as you can see, it's an instrument, so it goes in front of the effect. Obviously, effects are post-instrument. So now we can actually trigger or send some MIDI to this channel, and we can gradually fade up our volume fader, and we've got some success. Magic. So let's set that to a level that's going to be suitable without killing our ears, and we'll try and maybe tweak a little bit of our parameters in our device, see what happens. So here's the resolution control. This is the bit depth, the amount of bit crushing we're doing. So as you can hear, when we get down somewhere below 12-bit, we start to get into some more obvious effects. So by the time we hit 4-bit, we're a little bit more into the sort of bit crushy Nintendo sound from the 80s. So let's have a look at that other control now. We'll put that back up to 24. Let's have a look at the ratio. So we'll bring the ratio down. Remember, the ratio is how much sample rate you're reducing. So at 1, it's full sample rate. When we bring it down, we start to maybe notice the effect of this a bit more as it comes to lower numbers. And by the time we hit 0.3, 0.4, we should probably really start to hear a more of a sort of grungy, nasty sound. So these two in combination work really well, but you know, please be a bit careful because it can get a bit mental. As you can hear, coming down to really low bit crush levels. So the ratio and the resolution work together in tandem to set the parameters of the degrade object. So that's it. Fantastic. We're nearly there, guys. Congratulations. So guys, the last little thing we could do today is maybe see how we can actually push these parameters onto Push. If you're lucky enough to have a copy of a version of Push in front of you, Push 1, Push 2, etc., we can actually really easily map these controls out to your Push. This is because Max for Live integrates the functionality of Live through the Max for Live protocol, pulling the Max devices into Live itself. But we have to set up the parameters to show on Push specifically. It's really easy to do. So let's go back inside the degrader, open up the edit button. We're back into patching mode. So inside this GUI, let's leave the presentation mode, enter into the patching mode. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so you can see a bit clearer. So all we've got to do is add one simple object into this patch, configure that object, and we can add our 3 controls onto an external control surface. And it works really well with Push. So the object we're going to do is called live.banks. So N for new to open up a new object box, type in live.banks. Now, all we've got to do is just leave that in the patch somewhere. We don't have to cable anything with it. It's completely happy bunny sitting where it is. So now we've got our live banks object created. The final thing we need to do is configure our faders. So let's just go back into the inspector very briefly. We're going to select our output gain slider. We're going to move down to the very bottom of our inspector. And we can see here, there's an important parameter we just want to check is set to the right setting. So this is called parameter visibility. So over here in the drop-down menu, there's 3 options: automated and stored, stored only, and hidden. And the one we want is automation and stored. So this slider, the output gain, the live.dial, live.gain, is actually set to the correct parameter visibility. We do need to set that parameter for the other two elements of our user interface. So let's come back to our ratio slider, and inside the inspector, we'll come down to the very bottom, and we'll see that our parameter visibility for this object by default is set to hidden. That's no use to anyone. So let's look inside that menu and select it to automated and stored. This means it's picked up by Live's automation system, and also you can store your own presets in the Live browser, and that dial will be remembered in the preset. So let's configure that for the final resolution slider, and you can see here now we've fully tapped into Live's automation and presets. Now we've managed to set our automated and stored parameters successfully within our inspector for all of our user interface elements. Let's save our patch. So back to the Max window, and we'll just save over the previous version. Now we can lock the patch, double click on the live.banks control, and we can see now we've got a way to map parameters. So when you double click on the live.banks object, you're greeted with a little window here that allows you to configure what parameter will be stored within which of the 8 pots or sliders available to you on the push. So we can see here we have banks of parameters in push, and we could have multiple banks. The first 8 parameters could be, for your oscillator section. Bank 2 could be your filter section. In today's example, we'll keep it simple. We're just going to set maybe the ratio in the first slot, maybe the resolution in the second, and then finally the output gain in the third. So now that means that dial 1 on the push will be ratio, dial 2, resolution, etc. So if we save this patch now, and we'll come back to Live, and we should now be able to simply navigate through our device on your push. And look, no hands, mum. Woo! Obviously, you can automate that. You could utilize all the functions of push, if you're lucky to have one, to develop live crazy automation in a real-time performance. So guys, you've now managed to build our degrader. There's a few other things I'd like to show you inside MaxFly that will be useful. So let's have a look inside our little edit button again and open up the main patch. As we can see here, we've managed to create our little device. But there's a load more stuff you can do. So let's have a look at a really good way of finding out how you can explore more stuff. Hopefully you realise by now that what we've really done is stick a degrader object in our signal path. And we've configured the parameters the degrader needs. Well, the question is, how can we learn more about what this degrader does? So if I click on the degrader, select it, and we can see it's got its blue highlight, I can control click on the object, and here's the secret. If you open up the help menu from the contextual drop-down menu, you're going to see an example of the degrader. So in fact, we've just built this. This is the help window for the degrader, and we can see it's got parameters coming through from user interface objects. It looks a little bit different, this one, because we used Max for Live objects. They're using old school Max objects here. But the point is, this is an example of the degrader working. And what's really clever is you can actually unlock it and you can actually copy and paste it. It's a working Max patch. So every Max help object or document is a working Max patch, which you can actually click and copy and paste into your own objects. So it's a great way to reverse engineer and explore what you can do. Here's another little example for you. If I open up my objects panel, and let's go to maybe having a look at an object here called cycle. I'm inside the objects on the left-hand side. I'm inside the MSP category, which we know is for signal processing. And I'm going to pick up and drag and drop a cycle object. A cycle object with the funny little tilde is actually a sine wave. So we could use this as an LFO, we could use this as an oscillator, but if we want to learn more about what the cycle does, we can open its help, control click on the object. And you can see now you've got a little example of the sine wave at work. And you can see that the left input for the cycle object is actually its frequency in hertz, cycles per second, and its right inlet here, I believe, is phase. So once again, you can actually copy and paste parts of the help patch when you unlock it. Really powerful. And if you want to explore Max for Live in a bit more detail and go through all the different objects in Max, you can look at their help and you can reverse engineer how they're constructed and even copy and paste bits into your own devices. Okay, another interesting thing we could do is actually share this device. Now, this is obviously something we can put online. We could stick on a Dropbox. We could give to our mates. So often it's fun to share your devices with your collaborators. One thing to be aware about for that is it's actually a really good idea when you save your patch is to freeze it. So what I'm going to do here is use the snowflake icon in the bottom left-hand corner to freeze the device. What this does, it sort of bounces everything you need for the device to work on a second computer. Now our device is quite simple, so there's not a lot it really needs for freezing, but maybe you might build a device with graphics files in it, or maybe wavetable oscillators, and you might have more complex stuff going on. So it's a really good idea to freeze your device and then save it again. Once you've done that, you're able to stick that device on a different workstation and it should just work. So once again, freezing is a little bit like bouncing your mix in a way. It's a little bit like committing everything into a final version, which you might be able to distribute. So now you've had a little bit of an exploration in Max for Live. We've built a crazy, freaky deaky little bit crusher. We've used a built-in object in Max called Degrade. We've configured our parameters to work with a Degrade. We've used a couple of live dials and we've set the properties of the dials to be successful and accurate. We've obviously also added a little bit of a setup for our control from push, if you're lucky to have a push. But in short, everything you've seen here is the basic fundamental workflow of building a Max for Live device. It's really about configuring the properties to control the object you want to use. And as I said, there's so much more you can go into if you're looking at some of the objects available inside Max for Live. So what happens, guys, if you want to explore a little bit more? Let's have a look at some other options that might give you some more great places to explore to extend this audio Lego. So here we go, we've got a Safari here. So let's have a quick look at this. This is Metafunction. This is my little software company that makes Max for Live devices. So I just wanted to say, if you guys ever want to reach out to me, maybe you can jump to my webpage, send me an email. Happy to answer any questions you've got about your device. If you're stuck, you've got a problem, you can find me through metafunction.co.uk. However, there's also a load of other stuff online for Max for Live. Here is maxforlive.com. This is a web page which is not really associated or owned by Ableton, but it's done by one of their partners. And this guy's really categorized thousands of free Max for Live devices. So for example, we could have a look at the device library, and we can see inside here, we've got MIDI devices, audio effects, audio instruments, and there currently is over 3,000 devices on the library. Some of them are free, the majority of them are free. There's a few that might be commercial, but it's really a web page that lists a massive library of stuff to explore. So for example, if you're interested in an audio effect, you could go to the effects section where you can see the download links and little descriptions about how some of the effects work. So this is a great resource to learn a little bit more about Max for Live in loads of different ways. Definitely worth exploration, really useful web page. Finally, if we go to YouTube, we are here on the Cycling74 YouTube channel. Cycling74, the manufacturers of Max, the relationship with Ableton via the Max for Live protocol. But there's definitely a playlist here that's worth looking at. So on this specific playlist down here, we can see we've got programming in Max for Live, and there's 18 little videos that Cycling have made that will guide you through some interesting options to explore building devices. This is another really useful learning resource to dive into making all sorts of funky stuff. They make a dub delay, they make a little step sequencer, there's even a sort of polysynth in there. So another really useful resource to help you explore and develop interesting Max for Live devices. So guys, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Phelan Kane. I'm an Ableton certified trainer, engineer, producer, developer. I hope you had a good experience today exploring Max for Live and the different possibilities it can open up to you as a creative producer. There's a whole landscape of stuff in there. So it seems a little bit nerdy, but it can be really powerful to enhance your music and give you an edge over other people. You can build your own custom devices, instruments and effects. So if you've got any more questions, feel free to reach out to me, metafunction.co.uk. I hope this has been a useful experience for you. I hope to see you soon. Take care.